Okay, thank you, Caitlin. I did want to excuse Quinn Meekum, who is, of course, the Associate Director of the Kennedy Center, usually running this lecture series. He is out of town this week on university business, and so asked that I'm Stan Benfell, I'm the Director of the Kennedy Center, asked for me to fill in for him, which I was very happy to do in any case, but I'm especially happy this week because I get to welcome my good friend, Dan Nielson, to speak to us. Now, Dan is currently Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin, where he also serves as a faculty member at the university's Innovations for Peace and Development. Until just a couple of years ago, in fact, he was a professor of political science here at BYU. And some of you, I imagine, may have had him for a class at that time. And BYU, he assures me, continues to have an important place in his heart, right, Dan? While he was here, he was the co-founder and director of the Global Politics Lab, which is, of course, housed right here in the Kennedy Center. He's a widely published scholar, author of many publications in the top journals of his field. Let me just mention one of his publications, a co-authored book entitled Global Shell Games, Experiments in Transnational Relations, Crime and Terrorism, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. I'm also grateful to introduce Dan here. As I've mentioned, he's a good friend, someone I've actually known since our days as undergraduates together at BYU, where we both worked on the now defunct student newspaper, The Student Review. And for the last 20 years or so, we have lived in the same neighborhood, attended the same ward, and I've had the privilege of serving with him in various capacities over the years, especially in the Young Men's Organization. And I've learned over the years that Dan is a remarkably generous man, and I know many young men, including two of my own children, for whom he was an important and positive influence in their lives. When you get to know Dan, one of the things you first get to know about him is he has an insatiable intellectual curiosity. And he's a voracious reader of books from a wide variety of disciplines. And you'll see, I'm sure, from his presentation that he's a very passionate scholar who is devoted to finding the best ways to improve the world. And one of the things that's great about talking to Dan is he is refreshingly optimistic about the future, believing that the world is, in fact, getting better, and that we can make a difference in helping it to move further in that direction. So please join me in welcoming Dan back to BYU and the Kennedy Center.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Stan. Yeah, it's not often I'm introduced by such a close friend who knows things about me that a little more depth to the to the introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been to, since I was an undergraduate in international relations here at the Kennedy Center. I've been to so many of these lectures and in my 25 years as a faculty member. I'm still technically a faculty member at BYU, despite the beard. I'm on leave without pay and will be retiring and becoming emeritus faculty at BYU in the summer. So I love this place, and I'm really happy to be back for this lecture. So, all right. So right now, I want you to think about a time recently when you did something nice for someone else. Something that cost you some sacrifice, right? And in which you helped another person. So think about something, right? So maybe you tutored a classmate or donated to a charity or served meals at the homeless shelter or something like that. So I want you to think about a recent act of giving. How did you feel? Like you wasted your time or money? Now, if you were what Thaler and Sunstein call Econs and not actually humans, and you were rationally self-interested, it would indeed have been a waste of time and money. But that's not how you felt, right? If you're like most non-sociopaths, which means if you're like most, 99% of people, helping somebody made you feel good. This is hardwired into our psychology. I was told this might be a little bulky. In the mid-2000s, Jorge Moll and his collaborators put people into a functional magnetic resonance imager. Some of you have familiarity with this. We have one here on campus. And they gave them money, or they had them win money while they were in the scanner, right, to see what would happen with their brains. The MRI, fMRI can measure blood flow in the brain, right? So it's kind of cool. So they won money by doing some game, and then they invited them to donate money to charity, and most did. And what they found was that when people donated money to charity, the same regions of their brain that were active when they were receiving money, when they were winning money, were active when they were donating money, right? It was the reward center of the brain, which is kind of amazing, right? Paying taxes does that too. Probably not for everybody, but at least for most people, at least when this has been tested in the MRI. Voluntary donations do better, but taxes do it too. This connection between giving and happiness has been tested and found in cultures all over the world, and it starts at the age of toddlers. This is built in. This is one of the best things in human beings, in my view. It's also potentially a problem. Now, let me be clear, right? On balance, right, in net, I think that this warm glow of giving, this, sort of feeling of well-being when you give to someone else is really a net positive, right? It's really a good thing. One of the best things about humans. But it also might have a downside. So let's talk about the downside of the warm glow. What do you think? I know this is typically a lecture, but I need to be near the microphone so it's on Zoom. Can you think of downsides? I'll repeat them for the Zoom folks. And by the way, I'm asking not because there's a right answer, right? I have an answer that I've been thinking about, but I'm confident there are others. Yeah.
Well, I think, especially what this picture says, women can often be expected to give more, and then it becomes an unequal gender balance then.
Yeah, okay. That's a great point, right? Gender imbalance is one of the largest problems in international development. And this might actually, magnify it, exacerbate it. Yeah.
It may not result in true moral development because you're just doing something nice to feel good.
Yeah, it may not result in moral development because it just feels good. You're doing it for selfish reasons. Maybe you are an econ, right? You're just doing it because it feels good. Yeah.
It sort of rewards immediate gratification, so things that give you a direct boost instead of those things which are necessarily more effective.
Yeah, it might just be immediate gratification, so it might just be very short term instead of stuff that has long-term effectiveness. Yeah.
Giving something that actually isn't needed, just because you want the warm glow inside and you give it, but the person doesn't actually need it or want it.
Yeah, so maybe the person doesn't need it or want it. Yeah.
Or it could be actively harmful, like trying to give baby formula after a disaster, and that ends up in a lot of child mortality in places where there's not clean water. So your gift giving can be painful.
Yeah, or the gift giving may do harm, right? So giving baby formula after a natural disaster when there's not clean water sources might actually cause real harm. And in fact, this picture I showed at the very beginning of the presentation, if I can get it going, is the play pump. So this is one of the great bad examples in international development. right? This is the play pump. And you can see this is kind of a merry-go-round thing. So the kids play on the play pump, and it pumps water from the ground into the water tower and also purifies the water as part of that, which is great, except when it doesn't work, which is most of the time. And there are pictures, not very high resolution pictures, which is why I don't include them here, of women, sometimes just alone, whirling the play pump, right, to get water so they can do what they need to do. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on that. So right here at BYU, Taylor and others have been working on a project called Impact Evidence, and some of you might be involved in it. I'm one of the principal investigators on that, and we've collected 1,000 randomized control trials in international development, something we'll talk about in a minute. And I've done a random sample of these and sort of counted how many of them showed positive and significant effects for all the interventions tried, and about half do, right? So I don't know if that's the best estimate. It probably is the best estimate of what proportion of development projects work. About half. Now, the other half, it's not like they're doing harm. It's not like the effects are negative and significant, which is what you'd worry about if it's the baby formula, example, right? No, most of those results are just null, right? There's no significant evidence that it's doing good, but there's no evidence it's doing harm either, right? So about half, that's not so bad. It's hard to change the world, it turns out. So getting to half might not be that bad, right? So, sorry, it's just kind of bulky. When we practiced, it did way better. Okay. So we've talked about the challenges with the warm glow, right? Now my collaborator, Mike Findley, most of this work is with him. He was my colleague here at BYU and is my colleague at University of Texas now. Probably not a coincidence. We call that warm glow the helper's high. And it's compounded by another problem. This is confirmation bias. Many of you have heard of this. It's in the popular press and certainly in popular books on social psychology. The idea here is that people see the evidence they want to see, right? When they look at the evidence in the world, right? You can imagine this happening. One of the early studies, Lord Ross and Lepper found that when they showed the identical film clips, news clips to students, half of whom were pro-Israel, half of whom were pro-Palestinian, they each thought the exact same clips were biased against their side, right? Kind of puts football games, basketball games, and officiating into perspective, right? You see the same thing, but it's like, ref, you're blind. And so that's confirmation bias. One of my favorite studies about this was done by Weston and his collaborators. They put people in the MRI before the 2004 election in the United States. And then they showed them, news clippings or news, information that put their favorite candidate, either in a positive light or a negative light. And when it was a positive light, they found that the reasoning centers of the brain, when it was a negative light, when they're giving negative information, the reasoning centers, the prefrontal cortex area, just kind of deactivated, right? But when they got positive information, their mesolimbic system, the emotional center of the brain, lit up, right? And so we just are really, really, built to see what we want to see in the world, which might explain some of our political problems right now. So, now, there's some really interesting follow-up research on this. We can talk about during Q&A if you're interested. It turns out that people do update. If you give them information, they update in the direction of the information consistently. Now, sometimes it's very small, right? And they're more interested in the information that confirms their priors, so they update more in the direction of their priors. But they still update even if you give them contrary information. The problem is, they will update to that information even if it's false. That's a challenge, right? So, the problem is most of us as humans outside of our own fields don't have an epistemology, a way of learning about the world and knowing what's true or not, right? And so if you're outside of your own sphere of, expertise, it's really hard to make judgments. So, that's why echo chambers become so dangerous, because you're continually updating, but in the direction sometimes away from the truth. So, okay. So we wanted to know if this was a problem in international development, this problem of confirmation bias. So we contacted 50,000, 53,000 or more non-governmental organizations in international development. And we asked them if they were interested in a collaboration to do an evaluation, a program evaluation of their programs. Now we said, we have lots of commitments, so this is not, this is not a promise. It's just, let's gauge each, let's get to know each other better and gauge interest. And then we just measured whether or not they wrote back positively and said, yes, we want to do that. So what we found was, in the study, we just had an experimental condition where we said, in the interest of full disclosure, we should warn you that the results from this evaluation might be negative, suggesting that your program is ineffective or even counterproductive. So this is our negative proviso. And we just randomly assigned it to be there or not. Sometimes we gave them, sort of a positive prime as well, but the key was the negative prime. And we found that if we gave them the negative condition, they were significantly less likely to express interest in an evaluation. And we tried to do it in a way so they didn't think we were biased against them, which in one of the earlier studies might have been the case, but I think we fixed it later. But what's interesting is that it was significant in all three studies, but only at the most, sort of limited level of statistical significance, right? So we could see it; it was there, but it was a pretty small effect, and not super significant statistically. In these studies of NGOs, we learned a bunch of other stuff about NGOs that I think is interesting. If we signaled that we might have deep pockets, there was not a tendency on the part of NGOs to gouge us, right? In estimating the reimbursements for seconding their personnel to the project. We also learned they're really not very motivated by money. When we prime them about possible donor attention, they don't seem that interested. They're interested in other things. They're really interested in what other NGOs are doing and following the norms and standards and best practices in the industry. They're very sensitive to the credibility of us as research partners. We tested this by randomly assigning whether or not it was Professor Findley or me inviting them, or one of our students inviting them. All of this was done without any deception and was sincere, because we really are looking for partners for these kinds of evaluations. We can't do 50,000 or even 3,000, but we can do a few, and we are picking partners based on their responses. So they really want to be involved in the evaluations. When we said, hey, these are participatory evaluations where you are involved in the design of the evaluation, and we can train your personnel on how to do them, that got them a lot more interested. So most of the news about NGOs is pretty good, and of course this is only on average. I'm sure there are bad NGOs out there. We just didn't see much evidence of that on the whole in the main, so generally good news. Even the bad news that there's confirmation bias potentially, was really not that pronounced. So there were a lot of NGOs that were very interested in doing an evaluation, even if we told them that it might be negative results. That was pretty cool. So, most evaluations that happen in international development do one of two things. One, they do a baseline measurement before they do the program, and then they measure again after the program has taken place. Which you think, well, that makes sense, right? And it does make sense, but there are lots of other things that change over the time of the program, a year or two. And as Professor Benfell said earlier, I'm an optimist about international development, but not because I have a sunny disposition, because I'm a social scientist and I've looked at the data, and the data are all moving in the same direction. Nearly everything we measure in international development is getting better. And that's hard to believe, 2 years into a pandemic with the worst war raging in Europe that we've seen since World War II, with all kinds of protests and challenges. But I'm telling you, right? And if you want the data, I can show you just how everything we measure is improving. So if it's improving in most ways, then any improvements you see after the program, you might attribute to the program, but might be related to something else altogether, since everyone is improving nearly everywhere. So that's one way to do it. And you can see the potential flaw there, right? That we call those temporal confounds over time. The other way to do it is to look at those who get the program and compare them to people who didn't get the program, which would be great if you randomly gave the program. But that's not what's typically done. You usually pick places where you want to work, with maybe village heads that are cooperative, or in beautiful locations, or that are close to the road, right? All of those things are what we call confounds that might actually bias the results from the evaluation and make it seem like the program's working when it's really just the attributes of the locations that you selected that are better than the comparison set. So both of these main approaches to measuring international development programs ignore what we call the fundamental problem of causal inference, which is you just don't know what the alternative would have been if they hadn't had the program, right? If you could be God, which I'm grateful we are not yet, if you could run the world one way, change the key thing you think will matter, and then run it again, right? And then learn. But we're not, so we can't. So, and you need to know the counterfactual. What would have happened? But you don't. So, if this were the only challenge, we might still be okay. Maybe those before and after studies or the with and without studies would be sufficient. However, development makes things worse, right? So we talked about a couple of problems already. Here's another one. Development's a wicked problem. So this comes from Robin Hogarth, really famous book on intuition. His argument is that that two things really matter. How good is the feedback, the data you can get, and then if you make an error, how big of a problem is that, right? And some things are kind environments where the consequences of error are low, and the feedback is really, really good, right? So you just learn right away what you do well. Two of the things I've done a lot in my life is play tennis and swim, right? So tennis, right? You learn immediately, if you're hitting the ball right, it goes into the net if it's not, or over the fence. And the worst that happens is you usually lose your tennis ball, right? But usually somebody throws it back to you. So swimming, you just really can't tell if you're swimming correctly very easily, unless you sort of go through lots of training to learn what that feels like. And of course, if you don't swim well, you drown, right? So high consequences. Noisy feedback, high consequences. Development's much more like swimming than it is like tennis. So, it's what Hogarth calls a wicked problem. The feedback is super noisy. Also wicked, medicine and human health. Because of this amazing thing that we're all grateful for called the human immune system, which it makes you well even if you're being harmed by medicine or by medical procedures, right? That's, a big challenge, right? It makes for very noisy feedback. So people get better, even when quacks are working on them. And that's what medicine was for most of its history. Thousands of years, people practiced medicine. They were among the smartest, best, most generous, kindest people of their eras. They took careful notes and kept all kinds of data on their patients. It's not enough to measure, right? It's not enough to be caring. You got to have something else to cut through the noise. And so, they did all these things to their patients that definitely harmed them, right? Things that we think about medieval medicine, and it gives us the willies, right? That's what medicine was until really the 20th century, and really kind of deeper into the 20th century than you might imagine. And one way you can tell that is if you look at demographic records in the past, people who were wealthier died younger because they had access to doctors, to physicians. Way better just to stay away from those folks, right? Because they were killing you. So, how do we solve this problem, right? What do we do? Keep trying. All right, so just to summarize, you can read this, right? We have the helper's high, we have confirmation bias, we have a wicked problem, and then we have something I haven't talked about yet, which is the same people that typically implement the programs are the ones doing the assessments. So this is what economists call incentive incompatibility, right? Maybe you want to keep your job, right? So maybe you just kind of see the data, in a certain way, right? Just, you're not making it up, but maybe spinning it just a little, right? In a way that helps you keep your job. So, or keep the money flowing. How do you fix it, right? What do you do? Some of you I know, are familiar with this. Others anticipate where I was going. Randomized controlled trials were what fixed medicine. It wasn't the only thing. Lots of other things have been important to better medical practice. But this, I think most physicians would agree, this is what constitutes the evidence in evidence-based medicine. Randomized controlled trials, placebo-controlled trials. We also call these field experiments. A couple of economists, in the 2000s, 90s and 2000s, decided to apply the same methodology that was used, as close as possible to how it's used in medicine to international development. And just to, refresh your memories, it's been in the news a lot with the COVID vaccines, but with randomized controlled trials, the researchers randomly assigned one group to get the intervention, the treatment, and compare to another group that was randomly assigned from the same initial set of people to the control or the comparison group. They don't get the intervention. They get a placebo, or they're just measured without any intervention at all. And this is one of the most powerful things from statistics and mathematics is, it leverages the, stuff that gives you nightmares, right? The central limit theorem that just says because of the random draw, right? The the population in both the treatment and control group, will converge on the mean of the population, right? Each sample will converge on the mean of the population just by mathematical construction. And because of that, it means these two groups are pretty much the same, right, on average. And I've done, 50 or so of these field experiments, a couple of hundred interventions across them, and it's really amazing how often this actually holds. Doesn't always hold, but it almost always holds, right? So what it means is that if there's a difference in the outcomes between the treatment and the control group, it was caused by the intervention because nothing else is different between them. Okay. Two of the economists here that were kind of the pioneers of this, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo from India and France specifically, but at MIT for many years now, won the Nobel Prize in economics along with Michael Kramer from Harvard in 2019 for this idea. So it's not the be-all, end-all, let's be clear. There's lots of things that can go wrong, and trust me, I've seen them all in my work, or at least many of them. But we can use these randomized control trials, the data that we get from them, to learn what works and what doesn't in international development among the kinds of interventions that we typically do. And so that's the last 7-8 minutes here. I want to give you a few examples of things that we know with pretty good confidence. We never have certainty in science, natural or social science. We never get certainty, but we can have higher confidence. And let me tell you how we get that. Right? So you take a randomized control trial, a single study is never enough to indicate that something works. It's just not, right? Instead, what we do is we conjoin or aggregate many studies together statistically and look to see if there's an overall average effect across the studies weighted by the number of subjects in the sample and participated in the study. So this is called meta-analysis, and that's, of course, the key evidence in the evidence-based medicine as well. That most physicians don't believe a finding unless they see a good meta-analysis that shows it across lots of subjects in different settings with a similar intervention. So what I'm going to show you here, these are all findings that have come from meta-analysis of international development. So, okay. Falls asleep. But most of you are still awake, which is good. I'm glad you're doing better than the remote. Here's one of my favorites. This was actually done by Banerjee and Duflo, along with a large set of collaborators. They were working with the non-governmental organization BRAC. It's a microcredit organization out of Bangladesh. Amazing stuff, especially to help poor women around the world. They work everywhere, and they're just got a lot of energy. I've partnered with them multiple times, and I've just been super impressed by what they do. This is a multifaceted program, so there's lots of components to it. I call this kind of a basket of interventions or a bundle. They give people some tangible long-term asset, usually livestock, sometimes inventory for a small shop or something like that. The modal category was goats. Around the world, people picked goats. When I was a child, I raised goats, so I have a hard time understanding why people pick goats, but intellectually, I get it. So they also gave them some cash and sometimes food for a few months up to a year. They gave them small business training in how to manage their new small livestock business, and then they visited them a lot, right? Pretty much monthly, sometimes biweekly. And they made sure they could have savings accounts, so they'd have a way to put away any excess income that they didn't need at the moment. And then they gave them pretty broad access to learning about health and local clinics. They did this in 6 countries, and the results actually were pretty striking. This is kind of an expensive program, but it's very effective at what, at the goal of the program, which is graduating people from poverty. And what they find is that across 5 of the 6 countries, there are pretty robust effects. Trying. Come on. There we go. I mean, you probably can't read this unless you're on the front row or so, but it worked in 5 of the countries, but not in Honduras. And it didn't work in Honduras because most of the Hondurans picked chickens as their asset, and there was a chicken blight virus that killed nearly all of the chickens, in the area where they were working in Honduras during the period. So these things don't always work everywhere, even with the best plans and the best of intentions. Sometimes things go wrong. And what's interesting about this is that overall, for things like consumption and asset value and food security, financial inclusion, time use, income and revenue, most of these things had effects across all of the studies, even with the failure in Honduras. So that's why you need a meta-analysis, is that it doesn't always go as planned, and things work differently in different places. And so until you have the meta-analysis, you just can't make a strong inference. So next one, cash transfers. You want to get people out of poverty? Give them cash money directly, right? It's really kind of a low threshold, right, for success, right? Because if you give them cash money, they're probably better off than they were before they got the cash, right? It's not that hard to show evidence of effectiveness. So this is the best evidenced program in international development, and this was done in 2015. If you did it again, there'd be another probably 20 or 30 studies you could add. And you just give them cash. Oftentimes it's done on their phones. In East Africa, in Kenya, M-Pesa is a mobile phone banking system. And it works actually if you make the money conditional on their kids attending school and being vaccinated or not, right? The effects work. Kids aren't working as much, right? And household consumption improves. They can smooth all of the ups and downs of their consumption cycle, and they invest more. They save and invest more. About half their money typically goes to savings. The other half goes for immediate necessities: food, medicine, clothing, and fuel and the like. But people always say, okay, well, they're just going to waste it on alcohol and tobacco. That is not true. People try to tell you that. There's just no evidence that with cash transfers, people waste the money on temptation goods. In fact, there's some evidence temptation goods go down because people are less stressed, because now their lives have more certainty or more less uncertainty in it. So here is the results, right? This is on child labor, but the other results are similar. This is a forest plot. You can see the diamond at the bottom there shows the overall effect, and this is common. So you see, coefficient plots are kind of a pain to read. I showed the one before, but the idea is, the point estimates are the dots, in this case diamonds, right? And the confidence intervals are 95%, thresholds, right? If they overlap 0, then it's not significant statistically, but if they don't overlap 0, it is. And so you can be pretty confident that there's a real effect there. In this case, the overall effect, the diamond at the bottom, is significant statistically. It's not a huge effect, but it's a real effect. So helping get people cash reduces child labor. The consumption effects are even larger. So next one. Inquiry and problem-based pedagogy. So this was done throughout Latin America in 500 or more schools. In this, they, instead of teaching kids math or science by having them memorize stuff, they have them work on real problems. and there's an example there on the slide of learning ratios. Instead of having, learning what a ratio is and then doing problems, right? They actually calculate ratios like that matter in their own lives, right? And it becomes much more real to them. And what they found, this is kind of an amazing approach to teaching. Many of you experience this or have, in your college classes. When learning is much more applied, it just sticks much better. Not only did kids improve immediately in the next year or so, but those effects persisted 4 years later, even when they were no longer, so the more they did it, the stronger the effects. And that was true in both math and science. So there's the science scores, and eventually will let me show you the math scores. Again, coefficient plots, you can see most of those are not overlapping 0, so there's a significant effect there. You can see the pooled effect. At 0.23 refers to standard deviation. So the average difference from the mean, right, about a quarter of the average difference from the mean is the improvement you see with the inquiry and problem-based pedagogy. And there's an even larger effect for math, especially after 4 years. Kind of incredible. If your professors are not using inquiry and problem-based pedagogy, maybe just give them a copy of the Bando et al. Research project. I'm sure they will appreciate what you do. So, and finally, child nutrition. So this probably stands to reason, but a lot of kids in the world are stunted, and when they get stunted, of course, their physical development is stymied, as is their cognitive, probably more importantly, their cognitive development. And so just giving kids nutritional supplements, especially iron, zinc, calcium, vitamin B2, and protein, really improves their cognitive development, almost by 1/10 of a standard deviation. A larger effect if you do all 5, right? What is that? A 1/6 of a standard, 1/6 or 1/7 of a standard deviation. So, antenatal supplements before the kids are born, to the mother, also improves, but only if it's in the first trimester. So afterwards, a much less of an effect. And here are the results. But let's take questions now. And while we're waiting for the slide to change, the results will show up. Really interested in your thoughts and your questions.
We'll have you line up here, as many are already doing. State your question into the microphone so those remotely can hear it. And yeah, great, please. Oh, also tell Professor Nielson your name, what you're studying, just so he gets a little context.
Yeah.
My name is Emma Taylor. I'm an editing and publishing major.
Cool.
I was interested in the play pump example.
Okay.
I thought it was interesting because it's like a good idea in theory, but it didn't turn out to be as good in practice. So, like, based on your research, what would you suggest would be a good alternative to get the same, the desired results?
The Treadle Pump. So the Treadle Pump looks like a stair stepper. It's got handles and you can actually build them out of bamboo it's you're getting a workout while you're doing it, but the adults are the ones running it for the most part. Anybody can, I suppose, but it's just a much more efficient way of pumping water.
Gotcha.
So, and the Treadle Pump has had a huge effect on places like Bangladesh, where you can get another crop in if you can just get the water out of the ground. Yeah. So yeah, the play pump, bad idea. I mean, not in theory, but in practice didn't work. We know that because of evaluations. So good thing it was evaluated. But there's lots of stuff like that, right? It seems like it'll be great, but doesn't actually work.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Richardson. I am a family history major. I really found this lecture to be very interesting. I noticed that most of your data was pulled from developing countries, and I was wondering if you can use what you found to apply to, like income equality in the United States, for example, or, something like the conflict in Ukraine, where a humanitarian crisis has been sparked by a conflict rather than continuing underdevelopment.
That's a good question, and the answer is I don't know. There have been lots of randomized controlled trials for health and education in the United States. And so those would all apply. Some of these might apply, but until we tried it here, we don't know. And so you just got to keep replicating. But at least it provides a really good baseline estimate of what the effects should be, right? Especially if you're taking one of those meta-analyzed programs and applying to the U.S., you might expect a similar effect, at least from the outset. Maybe it'll be worse, maybe it'll be better. You don't know until you've done it. So, but yeah, I mean, it's surprising to me how often I have a program that I think will work. I try it in one place and it does. And then I try it with a new context and it doesn't work at all. So you just got to keep trying.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Caroline Weiniger. I'm a psychology student. I was just curious about the meta-analysis. If there's like a certain, is there like a certain number, like a specific number that a study is supposed to be repeated in order for it to like qualify for a meta-analysis, or?
Actually, no. Kind of funny. It has to do with statistical power. So statistical power is a product of the effect size, so how big an effect it is, and then the number of observations, right? So if you've got really strong effects, you don't need that many observations to see it. Of course, you need to replicate it to make sure that it shows up in other places. But yeah, so it's totally dependent on that. So some of my studies, I mean, we've got thousands, tens of thousands of participants because the effects are so small.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a calculus. Right. So yeah.
Hi, my name's Riley Kate Bell, and I'm studying interdisciplinary humanities,
Cool.
for what that's worth. And I want to know, how do you measure the impact that this has on women specifically? Do
Good question.
you take sex segregated data, or?
That's a great question. Yeah, so in medicine, it's well known that sometimes, a drug or an intervention works with some class of people, but not with others. Gender is, or sex is actually one of the key, demarcators for lots of interventions. That's true in international development too. So it is usually the case. I think most of the studies that I talked about today did what's called subgroup analysis. So they looked at it, okay, what are the effects on women? What are the effects on men? What are the effects of people over 50, under 50, right? They do that kind of subgroup analysis. Many of these studies were pre-registered, meaning that they called their shots before they did the study, which I routinely do, and I'm wrong about 2/3 of the time. So, I'm usually wrong, right? I mean, my wife and son are here, and they would say, yeah, that's certainly true. But it's way better if you call the shots in the subgroups before as well. Then it's just, I think there's more confidence in the study if you get the result you expected, which you typically don't. I mean, when I talk to other people, I'm not especially bad at this. It's about the same for most people I talk to, about 2/3 of the time. The result is usually null. Occasionally, about 7% of the time in my research, it's negative in significance. So I've done harm without meaning to. Now, it was sincere, right? I didn't mean to. I did the best I could to make sure that it would be safe beforehand. And usually the effects, if they're negative, aren't very damaging. But, because I've set that up so that it wouldn't be. But that's often the case. Sometimes you do harm. But you can't know unless you've tested it.
So do you think then the solution is to make sure that there's always sex segregated data?
You need to be gathering what we call covariates, right? So you need to actually, you don't need to segregate your groups by sex, but you do need to track it. So, and sometimes we do what's called block randomization, where we make sure that there's an equal number of women and men who get the intervention. We do that ahead of time, and that's always better if you can do it.
Cool,
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hi, I'm Nathan Hunsaker. I study Latin American Studies and Spanish.
Cool.
So at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that a lot of the NGOs are pretty adaptable with learning what are the best practices. My question is there any cases where NGOs kind of cleave onto these poor developmental practices that RCTs have proven wrong and ineffective? And what are those cases?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And yes. Unfortunately. So there's a lot of of interest in learning among NGOs. I think our research shows that. But sometimes they just have a program that they just believe in, or it's the only alternative. I was at a meeting in London with representatives from all of the world's largest development organizations. The World Bank, USAID, UK's DFID at the time. They've changed the name now. And we got a bunch of evidence about community-driven development projects. So these are usually post-conflict. They give programs to the community and let them decide what to do with it, right? And which sounds like a great idea in practice. But it worked in some places. Liberia had pretty good results, but I had friends, collaborators in that were presenting their research showing no effects whatsoever in a variety of other places. And so on average, on net, the meta-analysis says community-driven development doesn't really work. There's not good evidence that it works. But I remember so vividly people from the World Bank and USAID and NGOs, International Rescue Committee, saying, we're going to keep doing this. I mean, we really don't care what your academic results say. We're going to keep doing this. And we were like, beg your pardon? Why are you going to keep doing this? They're like, we don't have an alternative. There's really nothing else that has been put forward as a way of helping communities after conflict. So they're still doing it, even though the evidence base is really, really limited. So yeah, so that happens. That's common, right? So unfortunately. So Professor Hawkins and I, Taylor and our team at Impact Evidence, are trying to learn what gets public officials to update and use the evidence from the academy, from scholars and researchers to make their programs better. It turns out it's hard to get their attention and really hard to do better than just a basic invitation, right? If we try to encourage them with, this will be good for people, or, we know you're trying hard, or, other people are doing this, none of that works. The one thing that works is if we actually saturate their office with more invitations, and apparently there's kind of a buzz that gets going, and they're talking about it, and then they're more likely to take a look at the evidence. But it's really hard to get their attention. Thanks, good question.
Hi, my name is Ana Martinez. I'm studying economics, and I'm from Paraguay, so I was very surprised to see that NGOs are actually open to work with you.
Yeah.
Are these mainly big international NGOs, or were you able to work with local ones? And
it's a mix, right? There are so many. But when I say they're open, about 3 to 5% of them respond to us, right? So it's not a very high percentage, but they don't know who we are. This is a cold call email. Probably half of them don't even look at their email. And so, it's not bad, right? But it would be great if there were more interest. More and more this is happening as it becomes a norm or a best practice in international development. We'll see more and more of these kinds of evaluations. Duflo and Banerjee and Kramer winning the Nobel Prize in economics helped a lot, right? Because now it has the stamp of scientific approval. So I think it's happening more and more. It's been fun and interesting to watch the changes, right? As more and more NGOs are interested in rigorous evaluation.
Okay, I see. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, by the way, RCTs are not the only way to do this, right? There are other ways. This is just the standard, that I think most see as the most credible evidence. But there are natural experiments, and there are quasi experiments that also can produce really good estimates of effects.
Hi, my name is Ruby Fisher, and I'm a communications major and global women's studies minor. And I was wondering if you knew or could say anything about if there was a difference for poverty graduation programs and cash transfers, both, if the money and assets were going to women and mothers of families versus fathers or men, if there was a difference in results or spending.
So a lot of these cash transfer programs, and microcredit especially, has gone to women. And there are some differences, right? So, I can't recall if either of the meta-analyzers did the subgroup analysis. I don't recall it in reading the studies. But sometimes there are differences. We did a study which I didn't include here because we don't have more than one study, right? We did a study in Tanzania, we're replicating it in Malawi. We just gave away free smartphones to very poor women to learn what the effects of having a smartphone would be on people's consumption, on their economic welfare. And the effects were shockingly large, almost unbelievably large, like 20% increase in monthly consumption, which basically pays for the smartphone in 3 months. And we're like, kind of big, kind of not believable. So let's try to replicate it in Malawi. We gave the phones only to women. But then we learned that it was the households. I mean, again, this is after the fact, right? Sort of, post hoc. It was only the households where the women and their husbands coordinated and cooperated over the use of the smartphone that actually had the largest effects. So that in Malawi, we're training couples in one of the arms of our study to actually cooperate using the smartphone to see if that's going to make a big difference. We'll see. Stay tuned. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anya. I'm an advertising major and a women's studies minor. I was wondering if there are any patterns present in the types of programs that are successful and unsuccessful. You talked about the poverty graduation, cash transfer, and nutrition. Is there any evidence that proves which one of these is most effective?
Yeah, so the nice thing about a randomized control trial is because you know how much you spent on the programs, and you know precisely what the effects of the programs are, I guess, within the confidence interval, right? And you know what the monetary value of the positive effects are. You can actually do a really careful cost-benefit analysis of the programs. And, so with that cost-benefit analysis, even with our one study, we learned that mobile phones, just giving away free cell phones is one of the most cost-effective anti-poverty programs that's been tested. Other ones that are rank really high are unconditional cash transfers. The challenge with those is if you stop giving the cash, then other people catch up. Right, so over a few years, right, it's really helpful in the short run as long as you're getting the cash flowing. The poverty graduation program, the big advantage there is the long-term nature of it, right? If you get your livestock business going, that can sustain you for years, and I think they looked 3 or 4 years out, but my guess is it keeps going, and I'm sure they'll go back and check. So that one is expensive, but again, because the effects are long-term, its cost effectiveness is relatively good. So yeah, so that's one of the big advantages of RCTs is the cost benefit analysis it enables, because it's pretty precise estimates. Okay. So yeah.
Thank you.
Good question.
Hi, I'm Macy. I'm a political science major and economics major and global women's studies minor.
Excellent.
The whole gambit. I worked at the Ballard Brief for a while, and so I'm a nerd about this. But I was thinking about, the moral and ethic implications of all this, and this is an opinion question, but do we have a moral responsibility to regulate and implement policy that could regulate these NGOs? And I know there have been some harmful NGOs with poor outcomes that, I don't know on the international level if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess, I reflect my Davis County roots, right? It's a lot of libertarians in Davis County, right? So, my view would be, I think regulation can help. I'm more interested in self-regulation.
Yeah.
And there are movements in the NGO community to publish their results, to be transparent about their financing and the effectiveness of their work. I think that has real promise.
To increase accountability.
Yeah, I do think, we just have not seen much evidence of bad NGOs out there. I'm sure they exist. I've seen a few on the ground, but I just don't think they're very common.
Yeah.
When we did the opportunism study in Uganda, we did find an effect, right? So they were gouging us. But that was only in one place, right? And I just haven't seen that replicated anywhere else. So, maybe a little subgroup effect in sub-Saharan Africa, where Uganda resides. But there also needs to be really good standards about the ethics of these kinds of studies, right? So randomized controlled trials intervene in the world, and sometimes they can be done unintentionally, in ways that harm people. And so, you know, you got to be really careful about how you design them and how you implement them. So, you know, and I worked on, you know, on ethics in research, you know, in my professional organization, American Political Sciences Association, to actually track and, you know, and sort of motivate scholars to be careful about how they do these. So I think on both sides, there's probably lots of room for sort of better policy, better guidance on how to do them well.
Great, thank you,
good.
thank you.
Well, thank you. You can tell lots of interest, lots of engagement. Join me one more time and thank you for the Nielson.